Welcome, welcome to this web series. We know that there are enough, almost like an avalanche of webinars and discussion series, which has been very enriching, and there are very interesting learnings which are emerging out of this. And the topic turns out to be that we are reimagining and rethinking cities. And question really also really emerges that whether we had been even thinking of the kind of cities we are staying in, and if we are in such scenario, are we now trying to reimagine in the post-COVID world? As we all know that as INHAF, and there are, all of us do work in our own sector as driver and trying to be the driver of change. And Kitibai turns out to be, for all of us, a driver of driver who would keep always getting in touch with us to drive us to certain agendas. And we would agree. I think Amita's smile is kind of clarifies some of that. However, we all know is such a respected personality in the sector. I do call him a huge memory card of right from National Commission on Urbanization, with a great goodwill, which one can see from number of panelists and number of participants which we have been getting for this series of webinar. And I haven't really come across a kind of longish series like this, where we have diverse topic to be discussed, and from the wide range of interdisciplinarity, right from government officials to top technocrats to even practitioners like us. So there are several interesting initiatives where we're looking at whether there would be there had been also discussion on the whole aspect of planning, for that matter, on the ecological aspect, and definitely transportation fortnight was really close to the heartbeat for topic. And with this, the most recent one, the Gandhian city, had been also one of the really star amongst all kind of discussions where practitioners, thinkers, historians, and as well as really the admirers of Gandhi could imagine cities in a very different context, which was on 1st of October, was really one of the interesting highlights of it. And the real idea around also to build different partners together. So rethinking cities is almost kind of turning out to be a space where civil society actors are coming together to really rethink and also realign some of our ideas and build collaboration. And that remains the core idea behind discussing this through collectively and reflecting on our joint actions in future as we really reopen our lockdown. So it's also reopening the lockdown of several other things which we could potentially do in future. And with that, I hand over the mic to Sanskriti. Thanks.
Thanks, Avinash. And this Mobility Fortnight series of webinars. So we started with the topic of transform budget to transform mobility. And we had the second webinar, which was on rethinking the bus and how can we get better city bus systems. The third one was on the bus rapid transit. And this fourth and the last of the 4 webinars in the Sustainable Mobility series, which has been organized with the Sustainable Urban Mobility Network, SUMNET, and CEE with INHAF. This fourth one focuses on cities, people, and sustainable mobility. And we have an eminent and diverse panel today here, and we welcome you all. Anuj Malhotra, Amita, Bhide, Dr. Anant Maringanti, Hussain Indorewala, Manjula ji, and Dr. Vivek Chandran. So welcome all. I'll make a few opening remarks, and we'll have a couple of, or 3, maybe even 3, if time permits, 3 rounds of discussion and question, followed by the audience QA. And as we go through the discussion with the panel, dear panelists, I do request you to also keep look at the comments and the questions that may come in from the participants. And Avinash will also be trying to look at which are the more the ones that we could answer. We try to answer all the questions, but let's see if there are questions which could be clubbed together. And so to begin, Well, historically, we know that over the last several 100 years or so, and as was also discussed in the Gandhi and cities webinar, that that India has not only lived in its villages, India has also been living in its cities for quite a long time. We do have quite a number of urban settlements. It's not only a more recent phenomenon, and historically, people have created their own mobility. Old core city forms have been walkable and multiple use. And the same, city form, in a sense, is also, some of those principles are also in the new urbanism forms that we like to speak about these days. But with the advent of and the rapid increase of personal mobility, personal motorized mobility, of course, there have been benefits because people have been able to travel more to their education and work for all the things that people do in a city for their livelihood and recreation and social needs. But this increase in private motorized transportation has had a huge cost, which are very clear now in terms of the poor air quality, the climate change impact, and the adverse impacts on road safety, and also in public expenditure, because a lot of money then goes into creating infrastructure for private mobility. And there has also been, this increase has also come at the cost of the more sustainable modes of walk and cycle who get pushed out. And now these issues have, of course, been recognized for the last 2 to 3 decades quite clearly in India as well. And so this articulation of this vision for sustainable mobility that we have, and we think that we would want all our roads to become walkable, walk-friendly, that we have citywide safe cycling, that the informal intermediate public transport modes get better integrated. They do provide, we value their services, that city bus systems actually meet that lakh ko pachas benchmark that we have, and there's adequacy of good quality bus services that is available. And further, we are also talking about restricting parking and really putting some demand management measures for the private modes, private motorized modes. And even now, the car-free thinking, that areas will be car-free, this conception is now being increasingly spoken about. And so this is the transformation that we do desire. And over the last 2 decades, we see that this transformation agenda of that, we will have new mobility, we'll have sustainable mobility in the country. This is recognized in policy. We have the National Urban Transport Policy, and Dr. O.P. and others who've been instrumental in the formulation of the policy. Dr. Lohia and others have been part of the last 2-3 webinars as well. That has driven some change in the country. So we are talking about sustainable mobility, is certainly part of the public discourse. But now both, this policy as well as the finance, that we saw that the finance and policy as drivers of the sustainable mobility agenda, they have done something and they've done some good service. But are they now reaching the limits of their efficacy, and that the locus of change and the drivers of change, we need to now look for new drivers of change. And we need something more effective that brings in the resurgence in sustainable mobility that we now need at the scale and the depth and the really more sustainable ways that is embedded in the city life and the desire and the aspiration that we have for cities now. So the question for us today is that can public participation, public engagement, and the information, education, communication processes that must accompany these, can that become the new driver for the transformation that we desire in sustainable mobility at the scale at which we desire? And why does this become very important? Because we find that, even looking at the continuing importance of policy and funding, what we hear from the earlier discussions also in the mobility seminars, as well as the recent Lakh Ko Pachas campaign that the Sumnet has led. And what we hear also from central and state government and various other actors is that the quantum of funding, it's anyway very difficult here, that the quantum of funding from central and state government is going to be highly limited. And so the cities must look for their own resources, must look at spending their own budgets much more efficiently and effectively, way. And so, this shift that we want, that cities stop really building up flyovers and shift to making walk cycle cities and supporting IPT and putting money in buses. That's a change of attitude. There has been the NUTP, but its take up at the city level has really not been that much, But now we want it to happen. And so who's asking for this policy shift? Who's participating in the budget decision making? Who's demanding from the local elected representatives and the city governments that we want this budget and policy shift actually to see in our cities? The other thing is that, public understanding also, and transportation, as you know, is a bit counterintuitive. And, that it's not wider roads, it's not bigger flyovers, it's not more parking, it's not the supply side solutions which will bring us the change we want. It's in fact less of those. And this is not necessarily well understood. And the other is that, when there are voices speaking about mobility, the ones that actually are not demanding maybe flyovers, etc., which is children, which is women, which is the poor, which is the elderly, which is the disabled, who are in fact using the more sustainable modes, their voices, in fact, the 80% of the city uses such modes or needs to use such modes, their voices are not there. And they need to be there because the solutions that we design have to be appropriate to their needs. And also because they absolutely have a right to participate. And so we see that if we broadened the public participation arena, we got these inclusive approaches in, we had these voices in, maybe we would have different designs. Maybe the voice that comes out is not actually going to ask for flyovers, because that is also an apprehension that many of us from NGOs, etc., feel that if we open it out, will people ask for the wrong things? Maybe they will ask for the wrong thing, but maybe there'll be a lot of people asking for just what is absolutely right for all of us from the social and the environmental points of view, as well as from the economic point of view. So we can see that this very local policy, budget and design and service changes that we need, this is not going to happen without a great deal of public engagement and participation. And so the question for us is that in what ways, firstly, what can we learn from the experience of participation and engagement that we've had in the last few years? And then how really do we design public engagement differently? What is our new imagination for the future so that public engagement can play the really good role that it must play, and that it can play in driving the new mobility agenda. And so let's go into our questioning round. We, from our own experiences in Pune, we do know that, from participatory budgeting and organizing public forums, that it is actually possible to have inclusive, reasoned public dialogue. And, we've also done some citizen surveys, and we find that people do want to participate. And we have this something called the Einstein gap in participation, which is really the difference between people's experience of participation and their desire of participation. So if you look at a scale of say 1 to 8, the experience of participation comes to around say 3, which is that there's some therapy of participation, or that people are informed but it's not really working. Whereas their desire of participation, people are not saying that we will make all the decisions. They're saying that we want good collaborative decision making. We want to participate, and we want to see some influence in what we are saying in actually being implemented in the public decisions that are taken. And so we want to close that Einstein gap. We want people to actually be able to participate and be influential in their participation and have the information that they need and the space to be able to do the political negotiations for street space, for the budgets, for the policy reformulation in their cities for what is right for them, keeping social, environmental, because that is part of the public dialogue space that we would like to design. So let's look at what have been your experiences, and let's see what are the learnings from that. And so it would be great to hear both positive, what's worked well, what are your critical thinkings about what needs to work well, what is not working well, and see what we can learn from that. So I'd like to go first to Anuj. We've heard, quite a lot and seen great things that are happening in Delhi. And Delhi is probably quite a tough environment because it's quite populated, quite dense, and quite multiple use. And so negotiating some new things in Karol Bagh and Chandni Chowk, we'd like to hear how that has happened. Anuj is an expert in the realm of transport and urbanism, and especially cycling and BRTS design. He is the founder of Center for Green Mobility and is also associated with CEPT University, ITDP, and Good Earth Consultants, and the Hunar Shala Design Studio. So with this diverse experience, Anuj, over to you. We have maybe just a shortish intro, to speak about what has happened and, what are the great learnings that we can draw for designing for the future. A few minutes of that, and then we'll come back to you again for the more discussion. So yeah, over to you, Anuj.
Sure. Thank you so much, Sanskriti. I think you put a lot of things right there in the front in a very right perspective. I think one of the things that struck me while you were speaking is that even non-profits are fearful of doing good participation, and that is true actually. And I would like to bring it up a little bit more. So it's not just the government who is not doing it. It's actually also non-profits not doing it. It's a lot of people who are not doing it. And I think here is the big black hole, the big uncertain future that everybody sees and fears, because of which the public participation is not done in the earnest way that it should be done. And I don't blame people, because we've never really collaborated here in our country. Really speaking, we don't collaborate so much. We don't collaborate, within organizations. The feeling of collaboration is feeble, I would say, generally in this sector, in our nation. That's quite unfortunate. But having said that, I would go around this and say that even if the most tough things were discussed across the table, I think there is always a solution which everybody upholds. And I think that's the win of doing collaborative thinking. And collaborative thinking is something that we did for the space in Karol Bagh, as you mentioned, and some parts in Srinagar, where I worked also, and in a lot of ways in Ahmedabad as well. Karol Bagh, actually, as everybody would know, that Karol Bagh is one of the oldest places of Delhi, is the oldest market of Delhi. And it's not just a market, it's a living organism, because there people are living, working, hotels are there, there's a metro station, there's a whole lot of things, and it's one of the most congested places. Now, but if you look at the economy of Delhi, Karol Bagh has a contribution of more than 7% to the entire GDP of Delhi. So it's a very significant market to speak of. Now, having said that, obviously, more vibrancy, mostly in our case, means more congestion. So whatever place is more vibrant is also very congested. And we wanted to actually bring out the good part of the Karol Bagh, which is the experience of Karol Bagh, and bring it to the people, bring it closer to the shoppers, and have them like enjoy the market, the shopping experience now. But that was easier said and done than done, because Karol Bagh having a lot of stakes also, because there's very important people living in Karol Bagh. They've been staying there for 70 years, 70 or more years. It's been one of the most important areas in terms of commercial activity, in terms of warehousing, so come what you may, and there are people living in that entire area. So see, one of the things that we kind of it was having to deal with such an area is mostly very tough, because it's very daunting to actually take care of every other person's need and still kind of talk about sustainable mobility. It's very difficult to talk about sustainable mobility in such an area. But I think our take was that the step that we will take is only by dialogue. I think we had just a small paper, single A4 paper of design, where we thought that probably it was a vision for Karol Bagh, where, just a single A4 paper saying that, this street is better if it is pedestrianized. And we wanted to hear people out and see how they react to it, and also what their suggestions were. So it was, and we laid it out actually, So one of the other things is that we do not exclude anybody in the participation, in the participative thing. So we just not only discussed this thing with the shopkeepers, we also discussed it with the residents who are staying there, also discussed with the metro users, and with the people and with the street vendors who are also equal part of Karol Bagh. So each and every stakeholder was discussed with, dialogue with. It led to a long participative struggle, I would say. And in some small ways, the struggle is still on, by the way. Now, here is the thing that, when we are doing difficult projects and when we are talking to people, we need to be sort of very patient and tolerant to whatever they're saying. It's not like we need to be very reactive. In some things, we still haven't really kind of closed. We haven't really reached a consensus. But in a lot of other things, we really have, because it was such an open dialogue. It was an open kind of negotiation of what people want and what we can give to achieve the vision. So having vision being the central piece of that entire dialogue, we try together to say that what kind of negotiation is possible in different public spaces, in different aspects of public space to achieve that vision. And so if the dialogue is pretty much focused, I think sooner or later, people kind of groove it to that and start contributing positively. Of course, the first few meetings are not that successful, but that doesn't mean that the whole thing is going to fall flat. We need to be sort of keep talking about it and therefore reach somewhere. The whole, I actually have lost count as to how many meetings we have had for Karol Bagh. I'll tell you that it must be running into few hundred numbers, because it is like momentary, like it's every moment. We have a WhatsApp group for even having that meeting. And so we always stay connected. So any small thing we discuss in the group, which is full of shopkeepers. And that's absolutely open. We also hold meetings at that place, and we start to kind of discuss it on the table. We always have the traffic police and the deputy commissioner coming, discuss it on the table, reach somewhere and take that as a positive a kind of outcome. So it's been a very open dialogue. I'm very happy to say that it's been very open. Everybody is informed. I think that is a strength, because once everybody was informed, everybody took responsibility and they took ownership of whatever they were saying. And I think that actually drove this project ahead, because there's an amazing amount of ownership in this project, right from street vendors to the commissioner of that place. So it's beautiful in terms of ownership, and I think that's the success of the project.
Thanks a lot, Anuj. I think that was quite remarkable, and not only that collaboration is necessary for this, that inclusivity is absolutely required, but also that the team has taken on something which is hundreds of meetings, and so the time and the patience, and so to be able to tolerate frustration, which you may not always have great meetings or consensus-oriented meetings, but that you need the space for negotiation, you need the time for it, you need to be patient, you need for people to be able to talk to each other and figure out what's useful to do. I think that's really important lessons that you brought out there. So thanks, Anuj, and I would now like to move on to Vivek. Vivek leads the transport program at the Shakti Sustainable Energy Foundation, and he's also been associated with the C40 Climate Leadership Group and the WRI Embark Center, and also with CEPT University at the Center for Urban Equity. So Vivek, you have been looking at both policy and strategy, but also you've been the one who's supported, through Shakti, the Sumnet itself. And so drawing upon your experiences at Shakti and the other organizations that you've been associated with, and also some of the successes of Sumnet itself, could you, share your experiences of what's worked well and what are some of the lessons we could draw?
Thanks, Sanskriti, and thanks for the opportunity to share my thoughts here. Yeah, as you know, Shakti is a not-for-profit organization which seeks to facilitate the transition to a clean energy future, right? And from that point of view, transport and sustainable transport becomes an important piece of the puzzle for us. But I want to start by kind of illustrating to you that there are various parts to that pieces, and a lot of it's something that work and some that don't, and then give you an example of how the utility of maybe what Sumnet brings to this equation. So if you look at sustainable, and I think there was a question there in the comments as well, sustainable transport has three larger buckets, right? The avoid, shift, and improve kind of buckets that we talk about. Avoid being to avoid the trip itself, and where possible move to a more low carbon or low polluting mode, which is the shift to a better, more efficient transport mode, and then to improve the mode itself where possible. And when you look at the improve side, which is improve efficiencies, it's governed by a different system altogether, right? It's right now being covered by the BEE, which comes under the Energy Conservation Act. And you see an incredible amount of work that has happened there. And when we, for example, Shakti works on different sectors, right? It looks at industry, it looks at power. And you see a lot of work getting done from those agencies. They have very good structures, they have very good accountability, and they're looking for solutions. And when we do some good work, we do some good research, take it to them, they're vying to take up those ideas and move forward with it. When you look at the avoid and shift pieces, this is where the physical mobility is paramount. And that's where cities, it's the domain of cities. It's outside of cities as well, but in our context, we're talking about cities itself. And here is where people, the number of people vested, the stakeholders, while increases, and institutional capacity also becomes a constraint in the work that we've done. So when you look at some of the Shakti's work, when we started itself, we started with something called the Aapki Sarak move. I think Anuj might be familiar with this. And Ashok Lal led this work. And the idea was basically a tripartite arrangement, right? There is the institutions who are the municipal corporations, DDA, others in Delhi who are important. Then there's the people of the area itself who is going to be the recipient of the work in the end, and who's going to finally benefit from it. And then there is civil society who's also an expert, right? So it's civil society supporting civil society, essentially, as in the larger civic bodies and beings to come up with a better design, better living conditions for themselves. And that was, I think, a good, although I would say the work really didn't get executed as much as we would have desired. But I think it's a good model. And I think what Sumnet has done as well over the years, it's a very hardcore democratic institution, right? It tries, even its own decisions are being driven by the network of participants of the network itself. And then when it comes down to the people that they work with, they have essentially enabled voices to be captured, to then get considered, and then a policy or actions be taken with that. And again, over here, there is that tripartite arrangement. There are the people who are going to be the ones who benefit from the work, who would understand it, who would contribute to it, who would better it, and the experts who bring that translation, right? Now, if you have to design a road, someone needs to do it. And that arrangement is also present. And I think recently there's been great success, especially in some of the cities that would perhaps not get all the attention that the bigger cities do. I think Ramgarh is a great example in Jharkhand, where now we have a street that is getting designed through the efforts of Sumnet. And I think it's probably past approvals right now. Similar for both Gaya, I would think. So we are, through the network, I think we've been able to reach cities that we would never have otherwise. Personally, myself, in my effort in C40 and WRI, C40 again is mostly cities that are the large cities of the world that are part of the network. So almost by definition, it is where the attention goes. And even in WRI, I think we focus a lot personally as well in cities like Bangalore. I think Manjula ma'am will will also know some of the work we've done there. So yeah, I think public participation has been at the core of a lot of what we do. It is challenging. I think if you look at the efforts in the smart cities, we have seen, even when the mandate has been present, the reluctance to go down the path of talking to people and hence finding the solution is the difference between what is a successful project and a project that might have been designed well with the best of ideas, but runs into hurdles. And I've seen that personally in some of my work itself, where perhaps I've been unsuccessful to convince the institutions to actually engage with the people. And especially areas like parking, is somewhere where everyone gets up in arms. And these are difficult issues to deal with. So you also mentioned it is counterintuitive, a lot of these suggestions that we have, right? And hence it is of importance that we speak to people understand, and then they contribute. The contribute is where we really, I think the Armstein's ladder, the contribute does not at all happen currently. So maybe I will end over here. Thanks,
Thanks, Vivek. And, this important point that, if we are looking at certain very top-down drivers of change, then you may reach a few cities, so, but the depth and scale that you need, that's going to come about if you're really able to empower processes that are inclusive and are happening in all cities. And so what really can we do? That is something that we should take up in the next thread. But to continue looking at our current experiences, let's go to Bangalore and to Manjula ji. She is with the IAS from the 87 batch, and she was also present in the BRT discussion. And Manjula ji is the Additional Chief Secretary to the Government of Karnataka and the Commissioner of the Directorate of Urban Land Transport, where she has been leading the sustainable mobility agenda for Karnataka with improved street design and cycling in BRT and improved city bus services. And she has also, both in at DULT and in earlier portfolios, really been encouraging the use of a range of participation techniques and IEC materials and ICT in improving the interface of the government and the public. And in the mobility sphere, I do know, because I've read and I've also interviewed Manjula ji at one of the urban mobility conferences in Delhi about things like the cycle day and neighborhood mapping of mobility issues and other such participatory tools that have been used. So Manjula ji, let's hear from you. What has been the experience, and especially from the government as an enabler of participation? How has that worked out?
Yeah, thank you. I will have to actually go back a bit and talk of examples which may not be really from mobility. The first thing that comes across in my mind is the Pulse Polio campaign. I was a chief executive officer in one of the districts, and I had seen it was early days of Pulse Polio campaign. We would knock on the front door and people would escape from the back door. People would run away. So attitudinal shift is not, you can't get it in the blink of an eye. You have to keep on hammering what the message, and you have to keep on working on, convincing people. So I think that is something, behavior change is something which, you need to be at it for it to happen. And that, as somebody said, needs a lot of patience. Then second thing is that sometimes, what you think is a priority, maybe we want the discussion to be around sustainable transport, mobility, etc., may not be seen as a priority. So how do you do that? So in the past, I had also encountered that as a young officer in the field, where we would go and have this Jana Samparka Sabhe, which is basically public participation meetings, with the objective of, getting children to school, reducing the dropout rate and ensuring retention and so on. And everybody would talk about, we want more drains, better roads, and the entire conversation, the time that we used to spend there would be, more or less kind of consumed by that. Then, all of us discussed and we came out with an idea, and we said we would have Sikshana Jana Samparka Sabha, Saikshanika Jana Samparka Sabha. That means a participatory meeting just to discuss about education, so that there is a focus. So sometimes we may have to have, tweak the platforms, manipulate the environment to be able to focus discussion on a particular subject. having said this, these are the learnings which I think, when we go with public engagement, we have to keep in mind. And the third part you mentioned, Sanskriti, about vested interest. That also sometimes happens. So it is, especially in certain projects, there are people, and I wouldn't call them vested interest per se, but people who might be affected, because there is nothing which is universally, which is going to help everybody. Now, if you take away the road space, the fellow with the car will be affected because he will feel that, he doesn't have. So there is nothing which is universally kind of going to satisfy everybody. So that is where we may have certain voices which may be speaking against, but we need to be able to manage. So public engagement is that kind of a process. We need to be able to manage that process. We need to be able to take people along with us. Having said this, we in Bangalore, at least in South, public consultation may not be kind of is practiced as much as everybody would want, but it is generally collaboration and public participation is there in many of our projects. In fact, sometimes we do get the benefit of it. For example, Bangalore was fighting for suburban rail for a very long time. Hyderabad had it, Chennai had it. We had a lot of groups who started talking about suburban rail for Bangalore. It took time with all the government support, state government support, everybody pushing it. But the public opinion also mattered because there are people who are at it. Because sometimes what happens is in bureaucracy, people change, civil servants keep changing. So, but there was a group, a core group, which was actually pursuing this as a goal. And that kind of helped because that ensured that the focus continued on working for suburban rail for Bangalore as a means to reduce the congestion. So I think I see a lot of merit in the public, consultation, not just as getting a feedback, but just collaboration, working with people to achieve common goals, common purposes. You mentioned about Cycle Day. Now, Cycle Day was not just DULT's initiative. We had a group of people from various organizations like Praja and others who came one day with this idea to DULT. And then we thought it's a good thing to collaborate and we started doing it. For the benefit of people who don't know what is Cycle Day, it started as, closing one street on one Sunday morning for 2 hours, just one street. And we started with one street per month kind of a plan. Now it has been going 2013 we started and it is, till the COVID-19 situation, stopped, put a break. It was going on so much so that every week, every Sunday we had different neighborhoods having cycle days. This was basically to create a momentum around the use of cycle for neighborhood commute. So we had more than 40-50 community partners working with us. And today we find, for anything, we could really go back to them. And they are like our partners. They are the, kind of source of support. So now what we thought was that earlier it was more on awareness, working with them to say cycling can be good, it could be fun, it could be a, very nice means to go around your neighborhood. Now we have decided to go to Cycle 0, which is also known as Sustainable Urban Mobility Efforts. We have just put out a call and we are in the process of 15th is the last day to get the proposals. The idea is that let's now start working with the communities, with the neighborhoods, with a specific goal for the neighborhood. What is the mode share? Let them do some data collection, understand how people are moving from their neighborhood to outside. Can we make a change there? And as DULT, we have also thought we would set apart some money. Maybe it's not a big money. We're talking about 50 lakhs per neighborhood, and we are talking about 10 such neighborhoods or 10 such communities to work with. And we want to just put that as a, some kind, because many times, many of the communities may have good ideas, but every time they have to run around to BBMP, municipal budgets sometimes will be tied up with so many other things. And in the sense, because it would be approved by the council, it can't be changed midstream. So many issues are there. So we also put that so that our hope as a result of this initiative, or we hope that, neighborhoods would start using this and doing some small changes, maybe developing a public space, putting up a cycle lane, or even, doing some kind of a tactical intervention or whatever. And that kind of starts the change. So it's not just awareness, it's collaboration, it's working with, communities at the kind of at the cutting edge to make this change that is required. And I definitely think that our policies should encourage. We do have So, many times we talk about that, but I think proactively department should go to people and encourage the, getting not just feedback, but getting people on board while even designing. Recently, we were doing a design on Outer Ring Road for a cycle lane, and it is the cyclist who came with us who told us this is a pain point, this cannot be done here, you please do a detour there. So lot of benefit in terms of the feedback, in terms of suggestions could be had in case we take people along. So I'm a believer in that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Manjula ji. So some of the important points are also that that you brought up was that the framing of the discussion itself, that needs to be something that people feel it's their issue, and it has to be their issue. And so the framing of it so that it relates to the difficulties that they actually face, there is space for discussing those and relating to what you might come in as a policy or a project discussion. And it won't be easy, because we are in fact talking about changing practice. We are actually talking about changing certain types of behavior which are harmful for the public good. So we are in fact talking about reducing certain modes of transport and increasing certain modes of transport. So it is going to require change, personal change from a large number of people, and it's not going to be easy. And that's really the nub of it. And that, the space for negotiation that earlier speakers have also spoken about, and which you said that that there will be somebody who sees a different type of interest in it, and vested interest or a different interest from what may be the desired direction of change from certain people. And so what is the space, and who must, and everybody must, and these are inclusive spaces, democratic spaces, where the discussion should happen, because it's their space and they should be able to participate and define its use. So thanks for those points. Let's move to Dr. Anant Maringanti in Hyderabad Urban Lab. He's the director of Hyderabad Urban Lab, which is a multidisciplinary urban research center. And Anant has been thinking and teaching and writing about cities and urbanization in South Asia. And so Anant, perhaps also drawing from your work studying the platform-based workers and unions, and maybe the HUL's work with the taxi and rickshaw drivers, etc. So and maybe other interactions that you've had and thought about. What are your reflections on the nature of public participation so far, and how have some of these things actually shaped it for the better, or what have been some critical barriers in their doing so? Unmute.
I am muted and unmuted myself again. Okay. Okay, thank you, Sanskriti, and thanks everyone. Let me begin by quickly going over the kind of things that we have done about mobility. And I want to flag that as some of the things that we do, because mobility for us is part of a much larger urban existence, right? And that's the way in which Hyderabad Urban Lab has always functioned. What did we do? We began at a time when Hyderabad city actually did not even have a proper map of bus stops in the city. We didn't know what the routes were. There was a printed book which listed the bus routes, and we had the lived experience of what the bus stops were. I mean, everybody knew 6 number bus stop kahan pe hoga, 12 number route kahan se jayega. These were the kind of things that people knew. So what we did initially was to actually make a complete digitized map of all the bus stops and bus routes in the city. It started with printing out a large paper map, putting it on the floor, and then sticking the tikis that girls use for sindoor. That's how it all began. Why did we do this? We did this because there was this sense that, number one, the bus routes in the city, we thought, told something about the history of the city. Route number 1, route number 2, route number 3. These were all bus routes that started from Secunderabad and came to Charminar. Basically, it's north-south city. That's what the axis of the city was. And so the route numbers, as the number increases, we knew that the city was growing or demand for bus transportation was coming up from different locations. So the bus route numbering strategy, that is when people add a suffix to it, when people add a fraction of a number to the number, when you move from the tens to the hundreds to the hundreds to the 200s and 300s, there are spatial boundaries that are being crossed. So we were excited about that to begin with. The second thing was, of course, that we were all people who believed that bus routes in the city were, in Hyderabad, were very, very well designed and that they covered every single location in the city. So we made a map, we made an online map, which was very painstakingly put together. And then we did a public presentation of this in which we had a number of women and women's organizations being present to see what we did. So we started off by telling them that we have a fantastic bus route system, and the women said bullshit. That makes no sense at all, for the simple reason that the bus routes that you have cover only a small part of the city, and that doesn't include all the low income, low rental areas. More importantly, you go with the idea that peak hours are between 8 and 10 in the morning and 4 and 6 in the evening. For a large number of women workers in the city, peak hours are something else altogether, because these women work in shopping malls, they work in hostels, they work in hospitals and so on. It's a very different problem. That is when we wanted to then move on to try and figure out how do these people move them, right? How do women move when the bus system, which actually looks pretty nice and dense and thick and covering all the city, does not cater to the large number of workers in the city. And then we found that the city actually had something like 150 share auto rickshaw routes, which were completely illegal, but provided a massive amount of transportation at a pretty cheap price for a large number of workers. Then we started looking at the number of auto rickshaws in the city, the different types in which of the rickshaws and the routes and how they were making a living. This is where our work very seamlessly moved from thinking about commuters to thinking about transit providers, all of them roughly belonging to the same or similar families or income groups. So you're looking at something like 120,000 auto rickshaw drivers in the city. And if you say that, each of those must be supporting a family of 4, you're looking at 6 to 10 lakh population in the city of 80 lakh population, dependent on providing transit by auto rickshaws. And then you add another 20-30% of the population to that, because the mode share is about 30% of the trips in the city are done by auto rickshaws, 30 to 35%. It's a massive number of trips. And then we realized that there is no way we can think about housing or the transportation in the city and its sustainability without thinking about who controls the money, who controls the jobs, who controls the land, and who has any kind of opportunity to even make choices in this. Of course, there are issues where we do need to bring about behavioral change. We do need to make sure that small things can be fixed. We do need to definitely look at places where we can set up examples and demonstrations and keep constantly reminding people that these examples and demonstrations are important because they tell us what could actually be. We should and we need to do all of that, but we need to remember that there are structural forces which are constantly shaping the way in which people move in the city, and that structural power is located at particular places. So it's pointless for me in Hyderabad to go and talk to the municipal corporation about what they need to do about transportation in the city. It's completely pointless for me to go and talk to the road transport corporation, because that is not where the power to make choices lies. It just doesn't lie there at all, right? Does it lie with the IT companies in the city? To some extent, yes. Right? Does it lie then with the big investors who might want to invest in some big infrastructure in the city? Definitely, yes. So I think what we need to do is to be very careful about separating out the public that can actually matter. So therefore, we need to keep asking constantly, which is the public that we are talking about? And then we also need to ask, what kind of things do we want to do with this public, right? So for example, there are definitely cases where we do need to speak to the public to persuade it to change the way in which they move around. I mean, in my own residential colony, I think that there are a lot of people whose health will definitely improve if they walk 5 kilometers a day. I totally agree with that. I do think that it will be nice if they have a cycling path or a walking path. I know that there are a lot of people who cannot actually go out because of that, and that their medical bills are just too high. But it's okay, you know, those are people who can still afford to pay those bills. There are a large number of people who cannot afford to do that. And what do we do about them? Where do we actually create those kinds of conversations? So to come back to the original provocation for this conversation, that is, how do we create a public conversation and keep up that buzz going, knowing that you're not going to find answers and solutions in any quick, immediate way. I think what we need to do is to keep constantly asking ourselves, what are the kinds of stories that we need to tell about transportation? So to me, for example, in Hyderabad, one of the most important stories to tell has always been about how when I was in college, we were able to go around the city with a bus pass that cost 16 rupees. We could go to libraries, we could go to museums, we could go to meet people, we could go and sit in magazine stores and look at old journals, which taught us all kinds of things about electronics and electronics hobbies. Today, I find that so many of the young people in our neighborhoods are completely locked up in their neighborhoods, right? And the only reason why so many of them jump onto something like Swiggy once they get into it is because it gives them mobility. It gives them an opportunity to meet and see people. They badly need that. That's why they are on, they're getting into all those jobs. At some point in time, they get tired. Of course, they're going to get tired. But at this point of time, mobility is about aspiration, mobility is about learning, and they do go into that. And we need to figure out how to provide various kinds of mobility opportunities for those people, because it is both about an aspiration to move and also something that allows people to find opportunities. That's one thing that we definitely need to keep looking for. The second thing that I think we need to remember is that there are always moments, because of regional politics, because of national politics, because of investment decisions and so on, which tilt and shift something. And once that shift happens, it is very difficult to change back into something that used to be there earlier. So for example, today, if in Hyderabad, you increase bus fares by 10 times, I don't think that anybody is going to go and protest on the streets. It's just not going to happen, which was the case in the 80s. In the 80s, you increase the bus ticket or bus fare, people would protest. Today, if you withdraw a bus, you know, people are going to find share auto rickshaws to move around by, because share auto rickshaws have become so ubiquitous, right? And then for some substantial number of people, Uber has become a way of moving around. There are routes on which we have built large expressways, and those are routes on which share auto rickshaws and Tata Magic cabs and other kinds of vehicles have been making money. And if you try to run a bus there, that group, which is already there for a long time and making a living from that route, is not going to let it happen. You will have actually somebody randomly throwing stones at those buses, and those buses are going to be stopped. And it has been happening, right? So I think that one of the things that we do need to really think about is, for each city, think about, when did these structural shifts happen? When did this durable change happen, right? So the thing about moving towards making that model shift is basically a question of a big structural shift, because it is not about people simply making, you know, informed choices. These are choices that come because of a structure pushing you towards a certain kind of orientation, and you can't really get out of it. We need to figure out how to do that. So that's where I would stop. I think that it's really important for us to figure out how to tell these stories and make sure that these stories are told repeatedly. And that's the only thing that we can do at this point of time.
Thank you, Anant. I think what comes to me is also, the role that you're speaking of the engaged researcher who is discerning these patterns, who's locating these stories, who's finding, okay, so I'm talking to you and I'm showing some patterns to you. I'm telling you patterns, stories from different conversations. And I'm asking you what is happening here in this moment that we're speaking. And being able to construct not only this very flat sort of picture of walk, cycle, shared mobility, public transport, but how did we come to be here today, where we are in this conversation? What has happened in the city in the past in the mobility? The projection that we might be able to do with some sort of these what ifs, that if we are going to increase the fare to X from Y, what will happen? What do you think will happen? And showing the sort of system picture, not in a complex systems diagram, but in ways that people can understand that, yes, this is what we observe in our life. Putting the stories together to reveal a picture and an imagination of the future and a historicity of where we are today, the trends, that is a particular challenge, especially because we have spoken about this transportation being rather counterintuitive. And therefore, the systems picture is rather important to build up into the conversation that we have in various publics. So thanks for that. Coming to Bombay again, the question is that we've had some engaged movements and engaged not only in transportation but also in housing and other sectors of city life. Quite a lot of movements in Bombay. And so the question to you, Hussain first, and then to Amita also, is that, have these movements, have public pressure, have the struggles, have they actually changed the course of public decisions? And, again, when there are sort of spontaneous ones, spontaneous protests or spontaneous, claimed sort of participation that we see, as well as designed ones that we are seeing, And so I want to hear from you, Hussain, first, that what's been your experience of, public pressure, design movements also changing or interacting with the public decision making?
Yeah, thanks, Sanskriti, for inviting me. I would, since we're talking about participation and in mobility, there was one interesting competition that was organized recently by the municipal corporation. Soon after the elections, as a kind of a way of talking about, how we are engaging people in the design of our streets. And so they did a street design competition, and they invited architecture firms to give proposals for 4 different streets in the city, which they did. There was a competition, there was a jury, there were winners, and now the plan is that all the winning entries will be implemented through corporate social responsibility funds. At the same time, this very city government, which has been undertaking these initiatives in the name of public participation, has refused to implement the Street Vendors Act, which is, which has very clear stipulations about, mapping natural markets, creating street vending zones where there are natural markets, no street vendors should be evicted, and so on and so on. But none of that has been acted upon. So really, when we're talking about participation, there is participation of, what goes on in the name of participation is what, Anant was referring to, with inclusion of certain kinds of publics in the discussion. Recently, mainly due to COVID, for instance, over 120 BST workers have died due to the disease, and more than 1,200 have been tested positive. And, a lot of people part of our campaign has been talking about it and writing letters to the authorities about it and so on. But at the same time, we have this information for two reasons. One is because it is a publicly operated service, and second, because the workers are organized. Without these two things, we would not know what is the extent of the spread of the disease amongst workers. In fact, the private operators, we don't know, how many BST's private operators, how many of them have contracted the disease. So I'm part of a group called Amchi Mumbai, Amchi Best, which is a citizens forum for public transport. And when we came together in 2017 September, we formulated a kind of a charter of principles, a statement of principles. And there were three very essential things that we had, we began with. One was that the campaign was set up as an opposition to the privatization that was being undertaken for BEST. And this was simply because privatization privileges private gain over other values like public service, social equity, universal access, and accountability. The second was that we were willing to form alliances with other organizations, including trade unions and other transport sector workers. And the third was that we would place primary emphasis on creating public consciousness, organization, and struggle, rather than liaising with authorities. And if there was any, discussion with the authorities, it would be on the basis of those things, not as a think tank or independent experts and so on. So we have a lot of people in the city who speak to the authorities as independent experts. And, the problem with that is often that there are, certain kinds of, certain things that go in the name of ideas, or certain kind of, reforms that must be undertaken. But the policy environment as a whole is no longer in the discussion. In fact, there is a lot of agreement amongst the authorities and transport experts, even if they have a public transport orientation, about what should be done. For instance, the BEST has a committee, a BEST committee, which is supposed to, which mostly has elected representatives, and there is a lot of criticism of that committee, especially from public transport advocates, saying that these should be experts, these should not be corporators. Now, what will happen if experts are on that committee? It will, most of the, it will not be very different from the way in which, say, someone like Ajay Mehta, who was the municipal commissioner in 2017 when Mumbai Amchi Best was formed, where he spoke about his reform package to make BEST financially viable, which involved fare hikes, increase in prices for passes for senior citizens even. It involved a reduction of 20 to 40% of BEST routes, which were deemed as not profitable. It involved bringing in contractor-driven buses. It involved, a whole range of other measures, which were, which is what, which is, a lot of it is very much what the experts agree with as well. So I would really worry sometimes. I would worry a little about the ideology of participation, where on the one hand we are privatizing a very important public institution in the city as in the name of viability. On the other hand, then we say that, okay, now we'll have some participation about it. But this the fact that it exists as a public institution itself makes it to a large extent, even if limited, accountable. And that is what we are doing. On the other hand, the city government is investing a lot of money in projects like the coastal road, where in fact they did not do an environmental clearance because it involved public hearing. So to avoid the public hearing, they did not do the environmental clearance. Like Anant was saying, these are structural factors which really make what is called participation very limited in the kind of inputs that people can make in transport planning and policy. So yeah, I mean, that's broadly what I'd like to say.
Yeah, that's partly the nub of the issue, in the sense that if decisions are pre-made and we do really some itty-bitty participation, that's not it. And the actual deep shift is dependent. I mean, what is manifest as a form of public mobility or urban mobility is dependent on the structural space that we have of public participation. And certainly, as we can see also in the comment, it's really a shift in governance and decision making that we are looking for. Not small shift of okay, we are going to design half a kilometer of street and we'll engage in that, but really on a much wider and a deeper scale than that. And that really is a big challenge, and that really will be something that we want to address just a few minutes from now, after we also hear from Professor Amita, who's the Dean and Professor of the School of Habitat Studies at TIS. And she's been focused on the urban poor communities, on housing movements and advocacy groups. And she has a special interest in the urban transformation and how it can be inclusive and sustainable development, of course. She's also been leading an action research program on social and economic transformation in the N East ward in Bombay. So Amita ji, look forward to hear from you, your observations, your thinking, and really a critical presentation of where we are and where we need to go also, and what's been working well, and really the contours of what needs to change in urban participation, public participation, and yeah, of course, an urban governance.
Yeah, I think what Anant and Hussain talked about, there is a lot that I would resonate with. Because I think the first thing in my experience is that asking really the question about what is sustainability all about and sustainable mobility all about, and is it possible to separate the question of sustainable mobility? And I do see that bracketing happening in the course of this discussion earlier, where one is cutting off sustainable mobility from the pre-existing urban form, urban structures, consumption patterns, lifestyles. And I think this is something which is impossible to do. Okay? So if one is thinking about participation has to first locate sustainability and sustainable mobility in all of these aspects. There was a second thought, and which was that sustainability itself and participation. So how do we define and negotiate between the different values which are even associated with sustainability per se? Okay, I mean that it should be affordable, that it should be equitable, that it should be accessible, that it should be efficient, and it should be green. Okay, it's not possible to achieve all of these within one solution, right? So when people are thinking about solutions, when people are thinking about projects, there is a definite political process which is involved in achieving some of these goals to a lesser or a greater extent. Now, what is that process? And what do we really value? Is access the most important value? As Anant was talking about the auto rickshaw drivers, does that, is that and the livelihood of those auto rickshaw drivers the most important value? Or is preserving a well-functioning public transport system like the best in Mumbai, is that the most important value? So I think prioritizing and negotiating these values, I think, is very critical. The third, I was a little uncomfortable also in the initial tone of this entire conversation, which has focused so much on the how to of participation. Okay? And where one is almost thinking of participation as totally a design project, which culminates in something which is there. And that design and its execution is like we have achieved sustainability. I would actually kind of argue that one needs to look at sustainability slightly beyond that. And if we expand this, then participation at least has two kind of contours. One is participation within a project framework, and I think participation outside the project framework. Often projects have designs for how do you seek collaboration within, and there are some things about that that I would like to add. But I don't think we ever design for participation which has not been accommodated for. Things which are conflictual, things which get challenged, things which people oppose, okay, and different stakeholders oppose. How does one accommodate these voices? How does one create a space for these? Does one even engage with some of these voices? What are the non-forum forums where decisions actually get taken? Okay? And I think, again, looking at these, because there is a lot of value, and going by the Mumbai experience itself, I think it was great for several of us participating in the development plan campaigns to see that there are consultative forums which are created on one hand, and these are, I think, great examples, and we may celebrate the participation which is happening through these forums, but the real decision making was happening elsewhere. Now, these forums were forums where definitely those with weaker means, weaker resources had no access to. Okay? And funnily enough, even within those forums, the expectation often is that popular participation will speak the technicized language, terminology, which experts expect. So that participation is essentially a people's language. Okay? And that there are going to be multiple voices, that it needs to begin with listening, and only then. I think there has been a lot of talk about patience, multiple meetings, multiple forums, etc., etc. But I'm wondering whether that is actually a process which then gradually starts thinning down people, and only those people who are able to master the language are also people who become masters and co-opted in the overall collaboration process. So the real challenge for me through participation would be to see, okay, how does one listen to those voices which are untamed in some ways, who are non-co-opted, which are non-technical, and yet still voices which need to be thought of, because mobility is not only about moving, but it is also about life itself.
Thanks, Professor Amita. And some things which stay is also, I mean, many things stay, but some that I want to highlight here is that surely there is participation within a defined project, and surely there should be a way of doing that well. And there have to be in the life of the city the open forums, and certainly the development plan exercise that some cities undergo, not all cities even undergo, but cities need to have a place, a forum, a process where open discussions about where we are going, this visioning, this development planning, that can be the locus where such discussions can happen. Unfortunately, our development planning practice hasn't been that. It needs to be. That is one part. The other is that a similar open discussion could happen in annual budgeting and planning processes as well, which is comprehensive, and you're looking at all the sectors of city governance which are in the municipal. That doesn't happen either. It is limited to...
But transportation is often outside the city government
Correct.
jurisdiction.
It is. I mean, in Maharashtra and Gujarat, somehow some parts of transportation are still within the city purview. Most of it is not. Transportation, particularly, something which is a very fractured governance structures and systems, and therefore the need that when we are thinking of this transformation in transportation, what is the challenge that we have? It's a huge challenge because we are wanting the processes which need to be then actually anchored by our government in a democratic way, open way, by multiple agents like so the city government or the district planning or process or bus planning and down to street design and things like that. And say that, okay, there is a history to it, there is a future to it. It's connected to things like the street vending. It's connected to, okay, like where is the next siting of the land use, the whole land use planning itself. So it is fairly complex. And therefore the design or the processes or the acceptance that, public participation needs to be there. We seem to be recognizing that. We seem to be, speaking about different parts of the elephant, and but we need the elephant to go forward in the future in a good way. And so that's the set of questions that I want also to now focus on. And Amita, you also spoke about, finally, it's a question of values. So we are saying that we want open processes. Of course, we want also project-specific processes, but we want larger open processes where it's a reckoning, a day of reckoning, a process of reckoning where we want to be, which allows for these values negotiations to happen, not in the conception of a bureaucrat or a technocrat, but amongst people who are saying that, do we value this or do we value that? And letting that conversation happen. We are not saying that there is no room for expertise here. We are saying there is a definite room for expertise here. People are coming with their expertises, their experiences. They are providing their contribution to the system's understanding. That must happen through this process of dialogue in an open process. And there is a role for, say, the engaged researcher or the person who is, or the entity that is showing the system view to everybody. And so that's what is needed, perhaps, to my mind. You could say now whether you think that is something that is needed, firstly. And then secondly, we are saying, okay, so government needs to think a little bit more about how it must, create such processes. We are saying, okay, that there is a role for the people who can mobilize, can bring in people, especially because there are large parts of our society who have not had a chance to speak at all, who may not even have formulated their thought, and they will need some space and time to be able to do that. And then they come and are able to also participate in a more equitable way. Otherwise, the loudest voices, the male, or whatever, so we want to avoid that. And do NGOs have a role in that, or do researchers have a role in that, to allow for many such conversations to be revealing themselves, or many such views to be revealing themselves. We're saying that, okay, this does require some patience and thought and design. I understand that there may be some aversion to making it too artificial and too design, but there will certainly be design required, because you want the time and space and the information, the issues to be presented and framed and communicated well, so that people can understand. So there is some role for good communication and design here. And it's going to take a lot of effort from, maybe a team that is groups of people or different types of people who assist for the process to unfold. So there's a lot of work to be done if we wanted this deep-rooted shaping to take place. We may, of course, we can say that, no, it's a very difficult one. We don't want to get into it. And we are happy with policy as a driver, or economic or a market as a driver, and do that. But I believe that we are going to only get some limited results with those drivers. we do need these processes of engaged talking to each other and envisioning and asking from our budgets and from our local policies and other levels of policy. So the question is that, here in this small group, we are saying some things, but we have then the sectors that we belong to. And these sectors need to actually think differently about participation processes. So what do you think, amongst your peers, how will your peers get convinced or be able to engage in this project of public participation? Firstly, do you think it is at all possible, it is feasible? And if so, or you think maybe some baby steps are possible, maybe that's good. But how do we conceive of this change that we require in the way we work together and we work together with people? So this happens. So could I first actually start with Manjula ji, and what can we think about the role of the government, and not the role of the government, but how can we change the role of the government? How can we make the government actually enable participation in this deep-rooted values negotiation way that we want of the public in equitable?
Look, conversations have to start somewhere. And typically, many times it's the government which starts the conversation. Now, suppose in the COVID-19 situation, we tell everybody like, okay, please tell us how many of you want to wear masks, how many of you don't want to. Maybe that's public participation, but does it take us anywhere? So one has to be very clear because we need to start that. We need to, so when government says, okay, wear a mask everywhere, it's almost like a diktat, like a kind of an order, a command. But can we say that is, being given and it is against public values or whatever it is, the value of, society would be just be free, don't wear mask, free will, with the kind of things we have seen in the US. So according to me, we should not, straitjacket and complicate the discussion on public participation. We must admit and acknowledge it can be of different forms. Some may be designed for some purpose. Some may be spontaneous, and some may evolve with time. So, there are various, some, kind of develop, mature into collaborations. So we should not kind of straitjacket and say, this is the definition of this. So according to me, therefore, this idea has to be quite general, nebulous in such a way that when we are talking about public participation, we are open to all ideas, everything. So as I said, somewhere somebody has to take the initiative. The second point I want to mention is dialogues need not be initiated by government. I said conversation has to start somewhere and more often government does it. But I'm somewhat contradicting myself in the second point. I said dialogues can also be initiated by others. We have examples in Bangalore where, people who are very avid cyclists have started a conversation about cycling to work, and they've kind of made it into a movement. So it is always kind of, and now government is noticing it. So it could also be that in an open forum, in kind of, which is not within government, maybe it is not initiated by government, it could start small, but could grow big, so big that, even governments cannot kind of ignore that. They, kind of understand that they want to work with that kind of a moment. So there are various ways of coming there. And you talked about peers. There is that feeling that in government there is, I would like to assure you all that it's not that in government there is no space or time for public participation. Yes, probably we may need to structure our processes better or whatever. And it's also kind of a learning, but many government initiatives would not have actually matured or gone wherever they've gone without working with people. Because day in and day out, we need to work with people. Sometimes we have to work with through a democratic mechanism. So it's not always that you can go and ask about 1 lakh people what they think about. So there would be some people representing them and some people coming forward and giving, but giving their opinions. But I agree that there has to be an effort made to go to people who may not be otherwise, whose voice we may not hear. So that has to be done by design. Otherwise, if you have just a kind of a social media campaign of, getting everybody's opinion, this, then that, there are any number of people who will not be, in the process. So by design, we may have to do certain public participatory initiatives. So by design, we need to go to people who otherwise might not engage. By design, we need to understand what they want, what is their opinion. So there are various aspects, there are both spontaneity, design. So I would like to just conclude that. I hope I've answered your question, but I would like to say that we should not kind of straitjacket it anywhere, and we should take it forward in good faith. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think Manjula ji, what the question is that how can we get greater recognition in different levels of government, that public participation in the change that we want in sustainable mobility, we will have to design for it, and we will have to have these open designs rather than very street specific sort of design. So maybe we are starting with very street specific design, or let's have a cycle challenge or whatever, but we will need to soon move far beyond that. And how can we get this recognition quite well?
No, see, look, that is what I said. It's not that there's no recognition, right? Many people are working with the government. So sometimes maybe it is project based, sometimes it may be something else. But there are also lobby groups which are not government, which are not political, which are emerging. At least in our cities, we see them. And these groups are actually talking to us. They're saying, give us better, maybe it could be a cycle lane, and I mentioned about suburban rail system. So there are these lobby groups which are, kind of with no support from anybody. They're raising, one voice starts and multiple voices join that. So, and when it becomes, loud enough, everybody has to hear it, right? So it's not that there is no recognition or anything like that. We are working with, but I do kind of agree, but maybe sometimes the system, the processes that we do should not be because we need to do it, we should do it. That's the attitudinal shift, even probably within government we should have. Master plan is the example that you mentioned. It should not be that master plan has to go through so many iterations of public hearing, we do that. No. Maybe we use master plan as a means to get to know what people imagine their cities what they want their cities to be. What do they want what is their imagination about their cities? Kind of, insight, ignite those kind of stuff. So that's my, sorry for taking a bit of time. Thank you.
No, thanks, Manjula ji. I think what you're saying is that government will listen, can listen, has listened, and it will continue to listen, provided, the public is also demanding that it listen. And so then that says, and you're saying that if there are groups that, ask for it, then some things can also happen. Besides, of course, there are embedded opportunities for change, like in master planning. So could I just hear from now, maybe Amita ji again first now, is that, so what could be the role of, say, maybe comment on NGOs, but also on researchers, and also then Anant after that you, to say that how should NGOs work so that the demands are not small, the demands are large, or should they be small and then, you have a thin edge of the wedge in, how do we prepare ourselves to, as NGOs, to make this demand more carefully, more deeply, more broadly?
So, I'll just talk firstly, and I think Manjula's remarks were very interesting, worth engaging. So let me begin with that and move to also the questions that you were asking. Okay. And I think, yes, government often listens. I am also happy that governments respond to multiple pressure groups which are getting created in cities. I acknowledge that and the presence of that as well. Okay. But I think one of the trends which, for example, Hussain was talking about, and I was referring to earlier as well, is that there is a much greater, I would say, lobby which also works particularly on transportation and mobility projects. So if you look at the entire way, just to give an example, in which the JNNURM pushed the bus agenda in particular ways. Okay? The way in which metros became the thing across cities. Okay. Now, where were these coming from? Okay. And I think it is worth asking these questions as well. Okay. Where do suddenly, so just as there are these kind of international scale pushes and pressures which are also being generated, you also have very interesting, like there was a sudden decision in Mumbai to build roughly 40 flyovers. Hussain, am I wrong about the number? In the 1990s. Where did this come from? Did this come from planning? And many of these decisions do not fall. So I think the first demand in some ways that participation needs to take is that if one has to take a general sense of people, are all of these a part of a plan? Are all of these projects distinctive and kind of speaking to their own logic and different times and places and spaces? Within these, I think again, Mumbai gives a very, very interesting, I'll give you two contrasting examples. In the 1976, there was, or a more recent example, there are about around 13 very large resettlement colonies which have been created in ME Swat. Okay? Of these, there are roughly 6 colonies which exist all around a very narrow stretch of path which connects the Chembur station to Mahul. Okay? And along this very narrow, just 2-lane kind of a street, I would say, it is not even, the width is not even worth calling it a road, and always been very intensely crowded and lived with. Okay? When the resettlement colonies were created, much more towards the hillside, there was no expansion of bus routes. There was no attempt to expand the overall road width at all, with the result that today the issues of taking people to hospitals and to reach hospitals, and of course, because it is a resettlement colony, you wouldn't locate health amenities very close to where people are. Okay? So these kind of issues of commuting, they find their vent through popular protests. Okay? On the other hand, in this same stretch of road, okay, one of the traumas actually that people have faced is that there is a monorail route which was created to connect from nowhere to nowhere. Okay? So even today, so there is, it's not economically feasible. It has a ridership which is less than 10% of the expected projections of that time. Okay? And yet, if you begin to notice, why was this particular monorail route initiated? I mean, if one is thinking about economics, then the sensible economics would be to start a bus route, give more bus routes on this road, widen the road. Instead of that, one is creating a monorail route which does not even yield the desired accessibility and connectivity. Okay? Now, this is something which raises questions. Okay? How does one privilege one over the other? Where and in what frame are these considerations of projects even taken? Is that a rational frame? So my first plea would be that one needs to somewhere begin a discourse where several of these projects are discussed on a public platform. Some space for that. Okay? The pushing of many of these projects currently comes only from 2 kinds of disciplines, techno and financial. So engineers and financiers. Okay? Would we add other disciplines to it? Okay? This is the space for expertise and alternate expertise as well. Would one create layers of decision making? Okay? Would one create a process for responding to grievances, protests, challenges? Okay? Because often governance mechanisms lack a language to engage. Sometimes it is also all about listening. negotiating, and demands may be small. For example, again on this street, naming a monorail station, okay, as Mahul, which is the name of the original village, or naming it after the road, which is not historical at all. These are also questions of culture and of participation, which are very critical. And I'll stop.
Thanks. Anant?
Yeah. Let me begin by saying that, I mean, one of the things that I was really enjoying in listening to both Hussain and Amita about Bombay, but also from all the others who are on the different stories that I'm hearing. And I think that one of the things that civil society organizations need to do very well is to tell stories. I think it's a very important role, and we need to figure out how to tell stories much better. And we need to also figure out which stories to tell and why. And I'm saying this because I think there are a bunch of things that we have completely forgotten about over time. One of them is this very simple formulation that I've heard from a number of planners across the world, is that governments can outsource anything and everything, but not their intelligence. When governments outsource their intelligence, then you have serious trouble. We need to have some way of insisting that governments will have to get their intelligence back. And that's exactly what Amita is saying right now, right? That governments need to be able to listen in a discerning manner to people who may be speaking in diverse tongues and often may not say anything at all, right? You need to learn how to listen to what is being said. And I think that listen to what is not being said is such an important part of this game, simply because, again, a number of planners would agree with me on this, that planning ultimately is a question of figuring out trade-offs. And to figure out trade-offs, you need to get people who have very different kinds of stakes and claims around at the table and be able to speak. Now, in a society like ours, you will find that half the time, half the people are not there at the table at all, right? And that is not, I'm not saying that poor people are not being invited to the table. You will actually find that powerful people are not coming to the table. You will find that poor people may have come to the table, they're sitting there, but the people who have the power are just not there, right? So it's a question of figuring out why is it that people who should be there at the table are not there. And that's not an easy thing to figure out, right? Because usually what happens is that people get used to the fact that they're not going to be at the table and figure out how to survive. So when we often hear that
Anant, lost you? Sure, just move on to someone and come back to Anant. Yeah, okay. I think once Anant gets his connectivity back, we'll come back to Anant. Anuj, do you want to make a comment about how should then, whether it's within projects or outside of projects, what is the role of maybe professionals? Yeah.
Sure. There are very diverse things being talked about. Of course, there is governments are actually, you can say, not really. There's a pressure of time, there's a pressure of delivery, and small tenures that we are talking about. and one has to deliver in these small tenures. And therefore, a democratic process can slow down things. I mean, that's really the danger with, that's really the fear with all of these participatory processes. So obviously we need, if we have to kind of have a time for all of these things to happen, then it has to be a structural change inside so that everything does have a participation process followed for any kind of decision making. But most often than not, I would say that I've also, being a devil's advocate here, I will say that some of the things have not really worked well in participation, by the way. Like, for example, in Karol Bagh, we want to plant trees. The government wants to plant trees in the street, which is 18 meters wide, so that it provides shade to the pedestrians. But the shopkeepers are absolutely against it. So please tell me, what should we do? So it's not going to be always easy to say that, people are always right. They may not be, actually. So here comes also some of the layers of the technical people, the professionals being part of the process to actually advise and see that what a decision needs to be taken, which is conducive to the larger good of the people and not just a few. So some trade-offs are always to be made, even in the participatory process, is what I want to say. Of course, that doesn't mean that we need to get away from it. I mean, we can't do those trade-offs unless we are in the process. So, so here, I would say that the process is extremely important to follow. The other thing which I have found generally, which works for the government, like for example, if we look at the Delhi Master Plan process, which is being undertaken right now by NIUA, the National Institute of Urban Affairs, there are tons and tons of participatory meetings that they're holding for getting public opinion into for the Delhi Master Plan. Many meetings have been held, successful, some of them, not so successful, some of them. But at the same time, there has not been too much of involvement, engagement by the people who have come forward to actually engage with the government in this. But needless to say, NIUA is still trying, and NIUA has been putting forth a lot of public notices to bring about more kind of meetings. So one needs to also understand as people, as us people, that we have an elected representative. Now, we have an elected representative. Unfortunately, we never go to him back once he's elected. Why not? I mean, in the sense that, when we are concerned about our street or we are concerned about any of the system that is being done, why don't we go and talk to the councillor? Why don't we go and talk to the mayor, whom we actually elected? We definitely put more pressure on the commissioners. We put more pressure on the technical people who are the government people, but we hardly go and talk to the leaders. And I think this is one other thing that people need to also learn, that we need to be voicing our opinion also to our leaders, and let the leaders also have ownership of what the decision that they are taking for the whole community. So I think there is a lot of layers here. I mean, it's not one or the other, is what I'm trying to just say. And for the government, I think one of the things that has worked really well, I've seen in the past, is when government puts up the websites and puts out the information in the public domain. I think that has really helped a lot of people trying to reach out, trying to feel empowered that, okay, government is trying to talk to us, and therefore we should also give our feedback. I would have a humble request through your forum that if there are enough and more government people listening, then please kind of look at websites, or putting out their minutes of meetings, putting out their plans out there on the website, so that people can react to it and give feedback to the people. I think that's a very, very transparent way and a very empowered way of reaching out to people. That's all. Thank you.
Thanks, Anuj. I think, yeah, that is at the very least that one can ask and expect from the government, that you actually put information out there transparently. Whether it is understandable, etc., those are further layers. And as you said, that there is a lot of layering that is needed. It's fairly complex. Anant, do you want to complete your statement that you were saying? So please, yeah.
No, I just wanted to say one last thing, which is that apart from telling stories, I think the key skill that we need to learn is to be able to listen to the stories that people are telling, right? And I think that's one of the biggest gaps in a.
Yes, so it's identifying the stories and then having the stories told and also listening to them are three different steps in the first place. And combining the stories and creating a tapestry is also another one, I guess. Anant, I don't know, there seems to be a connectivity issue, so we maybe come back to you again later. Hussain, would you make a comment now on both from the NGO and movement perspective, but also as a professional and a teacher?
Yeah, Sanskriti, would it be possible to share that slide that I had sent you?
Yes.
Yeah. So, so this is, I mean, this really, the slide encompasses Mumbai's transport scenario in one image. And what we see, if you see to your right, you have all the different modes of transport and how they have changed over 98 and then 2008 and 2018 and projected up to 2024. And really the Mumbai city, obviously everybody knows, has historically been a city that has relied very heavily on public transport modes. And this is shrinking quite dramatically, in fact, alarmingly. And the four-wheeler has become more and more dominant as a mode of transport. Obviously, it's still not as much. I mean, in Mumbai, it's practically impossible for more than maybe 20% of the city to be, it's, I mean, mathematically impossible for more than 20% of the city to use cars. But what has happened is in 1998, there were 250,000 cars in the city. In 2008, there were 500,000. In 2018, there are 1 million. So every decade, the number of automobiles, four-wheelers essentially, doubles in the city. And this has all been in the name of relieving Mumbai's traffic congestion. So if we ask what are the, questions that really drive transport planning and transport policy in Mumbai, the answers that we get are things like, how do you make transport more efficient? How do you reduce congestion and so on? I think academics, researchers, even, movements that are involved with public transport need to ask better questions. So my suggestion would really be, if you like, that we need better questions. For example, you could ask, how do you change bring back the modal shares of the 1990s back to the city of Mumbai? What kind of projects, interventions do we need? That could be a question that could ask, which would, yield very different answers. Another question could be, why in God's name are all the metro routes in the city of Mumbai over arterial roads? Just asking that question will indicate that actually a lot of these public transport, so-called public transport mega projects have a lot to do with real estate rather than transport. Or for instance, we could ask, why is it that essential services that benefit a large section of people are subjected to the stringent market discipline, while transport projects that serve the better off get all the beneficence of the nanny state? Or we could ask, for instance, why did BEST introduce contractual services as smaller buses and point-to-point services and not regular buses on long routes? Does it have to do with the fact that smaller buses are being compared with larger buses to justify that it is more cost efficient? Does it have to do with the fact that they have something to do with providing ridership to the metro? If we ask better questions, I think we will have a much better understanding and analysis of how our transport systems are being shaped.
Thanks, Hussain. Vivek, what could you come in with? How can say funding agencies or enabling organizations actually bring about this shift in? Yeah.
Hey, Sanskriti, I think I lost you for a moment. I'm not sure there was an audio issue. I didn't hear that.
Yeah. No, basically that we do want public participation to happen differently.
Just give me one moment.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now. Sorry.
Yeah. So the question is that, what role can enabling organizations, funding organizations, support organizations play in actually this rethinking about public participation, embedding it strongly in the way government functions. So what do you think could be done?
Yeah, so I think this is something that we've been working on for a while as part of our strategy as well as Shakti, to understand how we can effectively engage better, because we had about 10 years of experience engaging in the sector, and we were asking ourselves the same question: what has been our successes and what has been our failures, and hence how do we engage better? And this is representative of the CSO community that we work with, essentially. I just wanted to also acknowledge that a lot of what has been said now are critical aspects to the strategy that we have come out with. The point I think that Hussain was saying, application is easy, right? And so there's no reason to engage at a certain point. Or without people, you don't need to, you don't want to hear or have difficult suggestions. And engagement by pressure groups is just not democratic. Not everybody has access to those bureaucrats. So everybody can't ask those questions, but that is a right of everybody, right? We need to enable everyone to have access to some kind of a system, some kind of a forum that is going to give them answers or at least respond to them in case they have issues. And and essentially at this point, the problem emanates from one essential issue that authorities, at least in the transport sector, and I don't mean this blanket because some sectors have figured it out, but the transport and urban transport sector has not figured it out yet. And hence, if you look at just the fragmentation and the number of institutions that are providing partial services of various kinds, and you look at the fact that they don't actually need to provide it in many cases. If they were to shut shop tomorrow and not perform that activity, there is no real way of saying, okay, this was good or this was bad, or whether its lack of its presence is even okay, right? Just look at footpaths, for example. Nobody's saying footpaths need to be walkable. They're essentially drain covers in most cities, right? So there is expenditure on footpaths, but how do you make it effective? How do you make it work for the people and make function as a transport infrastructure? That is the challenge. And when you look at the institutions that we have, and when I say institutions, that means legislation, standards across the board, there is nothing that tells you a footpath needs to be walkable in any sense. There's nothing that is legal as a document that will give you that. Some of our cities have adopted guidelines and others. Yes, but in the absence of that, what happens? So this is not a routine, normal occurrence. And that is where I feel a lot of where the problem can be solved, because then we need to bring in two levels of changes, and we need to engage also perhaps at two levels. One is at that fundamental level, the framework, right, which is in which institutions exist. And the second is those temporal framework, which is here, okay, the smart cities is an empowering kind of project. There is money coming with it. We need to engage now because that opportunity exists now. That's it. Once it goes, right? So that's the temporal framework, so at a project level. But the fundamental framework is what I think we need to really engage with, which will take us into a system that will create those forums that we have been discussing right now, because they are absent at this point. And I think a few aspects will make it possible for the institution to respond. One is a sense of obligations. institutions, civic institutions in the urban scenario need to have obligations to provide transport services. And those obligations need to be clear. They need to be backed by standards. And they need to be statutory by definition. If these are not statutory, it's not going to happen. The CMP is in fact not a statutory document. The document needed the comprehensive mobility plan. The document needed to build a metro, not otherwise, right? That's how do you make that statutory, and then how do you make engagement occur on that document? Because if you look at even urban planning, you look at the land use plan, there is engagement that is required. And going back to the whole Einstein's ladder, there is consultation, but there is beyond consultation, then there is some amount of application as well, but there is no other form of engagement. So how do we go beyond those points with the forums that we create? So there is an opportunity here because of the sheer lack and absence of legislation around urban transport. So can we put together something that enables this and enables it in a holistic manner? DUMTA, for example, was one of those thoughts, right? It's a larger entity, brings all the entities together. I'm really skeptical of one more institution, which is essentially a planner, and there are other institutions which is supposed to take away powers from. So that has been the failure of that setup itself, right? It has not really effectively been able to, I mean, there's no effective, I would say, example of it yet. But another mechanism that we've seen in other sectors, including in transport, like for example, in aviation, is the regulator, right? And the regulator is completely missing when you look at it from the urban system. So there's nobody checking whether, one, there are standards, but if there are standards, then are people meeting those standards, right? Is some kind of performance by the government, or the planner, the executive, essentially, is that occurring as per certain standards or not? And if once we can introduce some of these systems, and then lastly, perhaps a tribunal kind of system. I think Hyderabad has a town planning tribunal. I don't know how effective it is, but as an idea, it exists, and it exists in many other sectors. Can we have that as well coming in? And then again, there are other forums. For example, when we talk about the creation, right, the creation aspect of planning, we have the 74 that has enabled ward sabhas and area sabhas that can actually contribute. It has not been utilized. That's one of the problems of, I guess, the urban system. But a lot of those forums can be used for engagement. But I think we have to look at forums in multiple ways. Some for the planning purposes, some for regulatory purposes, and others for grievance redressal. These are very different forums. They cannot be considered one and the same. And they need to be enabled very differently as well.
Yeah. Thanks, Vivek. And I guess this also, different realms of participation, etc. And also this reference also to the democratic framework for participation. I think, yes, we live in representative democracy. I think the underpinning discussion here is that we need to do more than representative democracy. The fact that, you know, the Ward Sabha framework is incomplete. There are no procedures for flatter democratic participation, which is also perhaps an opportunity to shape it better, to do it inclusive. And perhaps one big takeaway is also that, you know, the need, and which has come through also some of the questions, is the need for the public to demand public participation to be different. Not only that we are demanding very specific things, that substantive things, but we are demanding something of the process itself. That the process of participation has to be inclusive and democratic and influential. And I'm not sure because how to, you know, consolidate everything that has been said, but I think this perhaps is a key takeaway, that this as a driver of the future that we want will need to be conceived of differently. There is a large landscape of what actually needs to change in government behavior, in enabling it, in support agencies who must also think it as a driver, as well as also the different actors who perhaps need to demand it and construct it in deeper and wider and listening ways. We are at 7 o'clock, but I thought if you wanted a few minutes just to talk amongst, is there a question you want to ask each other? Does anybody want to ask any other panelist a question that would be nice to hear? If you want to pose a question to each other, maybe we have just a few minutes for that, or then we have to see about and Anant, if you wanted to just quickly finish what you were saying second time around also, that would be good.
I'm pretty much done. That's what I had to say. Unfortunately, we're having a bad storm here this evening, so my internet is kind of very.
Okay.
But I'm good. Thanks.
Amita, any final words? Anybody?
No, actually, no questions really. But clearly, I think one of the big absences, since we are talking of silences, absences, I see here is what is the political thought around transport? And often in many of these panels, we do not bring politicians on at all. So politics, both as an act which is embedded with the way we participate, and also politicians as a separate category of people who are also involved in decision making. And I do think some kind of a insight, because I think that many of the questions and the discussions that we have had are inherently political. And I think a problem that we have is not making that politics explicit. So therefore, I think so the indications that we have had through the different discussions, the processes that we do, it might be interesting to also take that reflection from professionals in that field.
Thank you. Kirtibhai, would you reveal yourself both in sound and video?
Can you see me?
Yes.
No, I think my task is to thank everyone. But because I've heard everyone attentively for the last 2 hours, and participation is one subject, and I've been very interested in. As a matter of fact, when I dropped out from SAP 50 years ago and went to work in the villages, participation was my hobby horse. And in that context, I just want to make one small observation before I do. Thank you. There are 2 things that I want to talk about. We used to run a magazine called Ahmedabad some 35 years ago. It was the first city development magazine. And I remember having done a cover story on 55,000 lakh rupee costing, development plan for the city. And that cover story also had a cartoon drawn by Dhan Kakaria, which showed a plan hanging some 30, 40 feet above, and people from down trying to understand what that plan is and trying to comment on it. There was an absolute lack of faith in the system at that point of time. And then we did a township, for the slum dwellers in Vasna. And we had 50% Hindus and 50% Muslims, and went through a 9-month participatory process to decide who should become whose neighbor. And we had some spectacular results where Hindus and Muslims were sharing toilets, Hindus and Muslims were sharing backyards, and Hindus and Muslims and Wagris were sharing courtyards. So from this particular perspective and experience, of participation, reflecting and seeing now what is happening, be that Central Vista project in Delhi, be the design of the smart city project, I think in the country, be that metros invading our cities, we got to know that there's a huge problem in terms of how we deal with this entire issue of participation. Participation must believe in people. Participation should have trust in people's ability to decide. Participation would means trust in people's wisdom. And participation means essentially having trust in democratic processes and democratic institutions. And we know there's a huge problem in terms of how that is panning out at this point of time. So it's not something that I could take much time on, but I thought I'll just share this with you. So I think my task is to thank you. So Sanskriti, thank you very much for this very well-rounded webinar. And a subject that's important, but we know very well does not get the kind of attention it deserves. We need to work on it more on the idea. We need to work more on methodology. We got to work, as Amita just said, work on the politics of the whole thing. And this webinar has argued the cause very competently and very convincingly. And Sanskriti, thank you very much for managing and moderating this whole webinar, quite imaginative. Thank you very much. We also had a very resourceful panel, and we must thank all of them. They brought in wonderful issues on the table, and all of them are very well discussed. So I must personally thank all of them, Manjula ji, Vivek, Hussain, Indorewala, Amita ji, Malhotra, and Anant for the participation and for the contribution. I also wanted to mention something, Sanskriti, that I talked about yesterday. That as a part of this webinar series that we're running, we completed a fairly interesting experiment in terms of doing these 4 webinars on sustainable mobility. And it was an experiment in the sense that, I think, webinars do not really provide you, I think, good opportunity to kind of dwell on the themes and subject, with greater depth. And we thought, this particular experiment allowed us to kind of do that. And it's very hard for me to judge, it's for the participants and the people who worked on this webinars to decide. But we got a sense that it was a very good idea that we got 4 webinars going on a subject. It was a very useful thing to do. I also must mention that when you started, Sanskriti, you may remember this, when we started designing 4 webinars, we said we will not confine ourselves to this webinars alone. We'll try and kind of put together a structure which take this idea further. We don't really have, I think, detailed idea at this point of time, but we would certainly kind of, work on this and bring in a sustainable, I think, more ongoing way of looking at the whole issue of public transport, because enormous amount of work requires to be done on this. I also must thank all the partners who participated in this 4 webinars. That was CEE, SAP, Urban Lab, Subnet, and INHAF. I think we put this together. Having done this, we're moving to a very interesting series of webinars. On the 9th, we do 1 webinar on Manrega in the context of learning for the new urban employment guarantee program. We are hoping to kind of organize 6 webinars on the subject, and the first one will take place on 9th and will be moderated by Vidyanidhi, who is the Secretary, Government of Gujarat, Government of India in rural development. I also would want to kind of take this opportunity to thank my colleagues who managed the studio INHAF for this event and have been very, very efficient. And therefore, I must thank Hariharan, Radhika, Shimul, Elika, Dwani, Nita, and everyone who really helped on this. So thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much for all the 4 webinars, which were very eventful and useful. And we hope to continue doing this work and learn in the process. Thank you very much.
I just want to say one more thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, which was that, as you mentioned, that we do want to continue the conversation in certain ways, not perhaps again, maybe a webinar or not immediately a webinar. And I want to thank everybody who's been listening in on live as well as in this Zoom. And there are some really important questions that have been posed, which may or may not have been really answered, and they cannot be answered in the space of a webinar. Well, SUMNet itself is a forum which is interested in dialogue. And through SUMNet or through a process that gets created hereafter, there will be anyway a mail which is with for seeking feedback on this. But beyond that, we are going to just give you a very short form to fill in if people want to remain engaged in this conversation on participation in mobility and planning, urban planning, and urban mobility planning. Then do fill it out, and we figure out ways of taking the conversation forward in larger forums, in a larger gathering and grouping. So just wanted to say that. We don't know what it is, but we probably need to shape that together in a democratic way.
Thank you. Thank you. So thank you very much, to everyone, I think, for your presence, for your contribution, and we look forward to talking to you again. Thank you very much.